Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kevin Masaryk. I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon session here. Many of you may have joined us for morning sessions. There's a variety of different themes or tracks. This afternoon, this particular session will be focusing on one of the more widespread groundwater contaminants that we find here in Wisconsin, and some of the different things or activities that the DNR is doing around addressing the issue of nitrate in groundwater. So we are going to be hearing from two speakers from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in a little bit. Before I do their introduction, I just want to do a quick kind of thank you to all our sponsors of the conference. If you would like to check out those sponsors, please do visit some of the exhibits during the breaks and other opportunities for networking. Another kind of housekeeping activity, we will have a Q&A. The Q&A, if you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat feature within the EventMobi platform to enter those questions. During the presentation, or more likely after our speakers are done presenting, I will try to get to as many questions as we can with the speakers. So please, during the presentation, feel free to enter those as we go along. With that, this afternoon, we're going to be hearing about an update on the NR 151 Nitrate Targeted Performance Standard. And our two speakers come to us from the Wisconsin DNR, with the first being Mike Gilbertson. Mike is the Agricultural Non-Point Source Implementation Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's located out of the central office in Madison within the Agricultural Runoff section of the Watershed Management Bureau. Most of Mike's work involves coordinating statewide implementation and policies related to the ag runoff management rules in NR 151. He's in the 20th year at the DNR and has served in a variety of positions, all related to managing water resources of Wisconsin. Our second speaker is Chris Clayton. Chris, also with the DNR, is the Agricultural Runoff Section Chief. He manages staff in the Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, otherwise known as CAFO, permitting program, and agricultural non-point program out of the DNR's Madison office. Before working at the DNR, Chris worked at the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection and River Alliance of Wisconsin. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to hear more about this process.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. Yeah, there's a lot of things going on with NR 151 right now, and related to the revisions that were in the works. But before we get into that rule revision, the targeted standard, we wanted to also provide a little bit of a background on NR 151. What is this administrative code, and where did it come from? And some examples of how it works, and those involved, and just try to get set up to then understanding why we have a targeted standard in the works currently. So, NR 151, we talk about it in general. It's Wisconsin's administrative code for controlling runoff, and it's more than just agriculture. There's other sections in there. But when we talk about 151, we're talking about the agricultural side of it. So NR 151 is one part of Wisconsin's non-point source pollution abatement program, and that program was born basically out of the Clean Water Act, and it started in a different form in the late 70s, and it was called the Priority Watershed Program. But a lot of the same principles, a lot of the same language terminology actually comes from the Priority Watershed Program and is carried on into our program that we have now. And so we had the Priority Watershed Program. It was a very successful program. It was obviously, by the title of it, you can see that it worked within watersheds, and it was it was an expensive program, but very successful. And then as that went on for many years in the late 90s, as the legislature started looking at ways to reduce budgets, cut back on some things, they looked at finding a different way to finding changes that could be made to our to the non-point source pollution abatement program in Wisconsin. And this is actual language that, we still have the files from the non-point program redesign that started in the late 90s. But you can see in some of this language in here from our governor, Governor Thompson back then was, we can't keep throwing money at the program and the process. And so that was the angle it was coming from. It started seeing this language of, DNR must set performance standards, and DADCAP needs to develop nutrient management policy. This is what they were talking about back in the late 90s, that led to what we currently have now. And so in the late 90s is when the legislature instructed the Department of Natural Resources to develop or redesign our non-point source pollution abatement program in Wisconsin, getting away from the priority watershed program and develop something that's more more efficient, maybe is one angle they're coming from. And they also recognize that our county land conservation departments had the capability to take on more of this. So it also defined a locally led program. And so with that, it was written in statute, and it is in statute that it says, DNR's role is defining the what. Basically, it's one way to say that DNR's role is defining what are the rules that in the ag performance standard side of it that farmers would have to follow to protect water quality. It says in the statute of DADCAP's role. And so it sets up this partnership with DNR and DADCAP. And as DNR defines the what, DADCAP in their administrative code, ADCAP 50, describes the how. So as these two administrative codes work together, DADCAP will say, if this is in their code, they would say, this is what are some practices that could be installed that would help a producer, a farmer, come into compliance with the rules that DNR has defined. And so that's sort of the setup of that partnership. And it also started defining a cost share requirement for implementation. And when we talk about implementation, we talk about where we work with a producer that may have something going on at the farm that is not compliant with the rules defined in NR 151. And then by implementation, we would work with them to build either, let's say a barnyard runoff control system to address the non-compliance at the site. That's one example. And there's many examples of implementation of NR 151 to achieve compliance on the production site, on the farms in Wisconsin. So again, in general, elements of NR 151. NR 151, like I said, is our statewide runoff management administrative code, and it extends beyond just farms. You can see here that there's other sections that make up the entire NR 151. There's requirements for non-ag performance standards and transportation facilities and other things. So, when we talk about NR 151, for the most part, especially us when in our section, we're talking about subsection 2 of NR 151, and specifically the agricultural performance standards and prohibitions. When we get to that, that's where this nitrate targeted performance standard that Chris will talk about here in a minute, that's where this would lie. It would be within this subsection 2 of NR 151. But so just clarifying that when we're talking about, for our purposes, we're talking about the ag performance standards and prohibitions within NR 151. And so then within subchapter 2 and the ag performance standards, what's in there? And so if you go into the administrative code, it's broken up into these sections, and besides the definitions and other things that go into the code, NR 151 02 to 08 lists the different performance standards and prohibitions. So it explicitly addresses those things that farms have to do and must be in compliance with. And then it gets into other sections that talk about where implementation of the performance standards does not protect water quality enough. It describes the process that would go on for developing a targeted performance standard. And again, that's important for for later on in this presentation in talking about the nitrate targeted performance standard that's currently in the works. It also gets into describing how we communicate with landowners. So if we determine there's non-compliance, it describes what we have to communicate to the landowner, what is exactly non-compliance, what are some of the other options that we could install to maybe correct a situation that is causing runoff to waters of the state or something. So it's also explicit in the types of communication, the types of information we need to share with our producers, and the options that they have, and resources, technical resources to help correct a situation. There's other sections too regarding local ordinances, the allowance for municipalities to adopt their own local ordinances that may go beyond the rules of 151, but we're not going to get too deep into that stuff. We're just giving a general description of what the administrative code is. And then there's a variance process where if a producer just cannot meet the requirements of the performance standards, what's the process for allowing a variance in limited situations. So again, the statewide agricultural performance standards, what actually are they? And without getting to all the language within it, in general, we're talking about cropland performance standards. So what goes on in the fields, limiting sheet, rill, and wind erosion. There's a tillage setback from streams to just physically prevent sod from falling into streams, for example. There's a phosphorus index that requires fields to be managed that limits the amount of phosphorus loss from those fields. And usually that's built into a nutrient management plan. There's performance standards for manure storage facilities, how they're managed, with the intent there to reduce the risk of manure storage failure or overtopping pits. Construction of manure storage facilities need to meet technical standards so that they're that they're constructed to a standard that would limit failure. And again, process wastewater handling, process wastewater being things such as milk house waste or feed leachate from food or the silage in the animal feed, that leachate is not leaving the production site and getting into waters of the state. It can be collected and handled. There's clean water diversions, things that would prevent clean water from running onto, let's say, a barnyard and causing now a polluted water source that's running off a barnyard. And then of course, nutrient management plans, the requirement that farms spread nutrients, manure and nutrients on their fields according to a nutrient management plan. And these basically make up the statewide agricultural performance standards. There's another section in here, and we talk about performance standards and prohibitions. And actually, these 4 prohibitions were in statute. Actually, they are in statute, but when the statute was created to have the DNR write or develop NR 151, the legislature said the minimum that has to be in this are these 4 prohibitions. So these, so we talk about performance standards and prohibitions. These are the 4 prohibitions that are in 151. So no overflow of manure storage facilities, no unconfined manure in a water quality management area. So manure piles within certain distances of streams and lakes and wetlands, and you can't have direct runoff from a feedlot, and livestock grazing can't cause denuded conditions along the stream banks, so that these stream banks are protected, they have vegetative cover. These are the 4 manure management prohibitions that was the minimum that we're required to develop for in creating NR 151. So again, we talk about statewide performance standards and prohibitions. And now what we're getting into is targeted performance standards. And so where implementation of the statewide standards hasn't shown to be protective enough of the water to maintain water quality or meet water quality standards, that creates a situation where maybe a targeted performance standard would need to be created. And that's what we're getting into with the nitrate standard. It's in the works currently, and is also the type of standard that was created in 2018, just a couple of years ago. That was the first targeted standard created and and put into NR 151. So, some of the considerations and, that would go into creating a targeted standard is geology is one, physical parameters, and and that was a situation with the Silurian bedrock performance standard that was created in 2018. Just an image there that shows kind of the area of the state that this rule applies. It's a targeted, it's a part of the state that this rule applies to. And there's other pollutants of concern, or there's monitoring data or modeling that may indicate problems in certain areas. Those are all supporting pieces of information that would support the development of a targeted standard. So again, I talked a little bit about implementation strategy, but this is you can see the partnerships, and these partnerships are critical for successful implementation and working with our producers. But you can see all of us are involved and have roles in working to implement our non-point source pollution abatement program. We rely heavily on our county land conservation departments to be that, those boots on the ground that are meeting with the producers, being that first contact to talk about, where there might be a situation that has to be fixed. We have non-compliance. What are some options we have to fix this? And so we work closely with our county land conservation department across the state. And then we have, DADCAP, again, with this partnership with DNR and DADCAP, our roles that are defined in statute. DADCAP provides a lot of funding to the counties for staffing. They also have grants and other incentives for installing practices to protect water quality. Of course, DNR does have an enforcement role in situations that would require that. But we also provide technical assistance, and we have grants as well that can help cost share practices to be installed for producers that need to fix something on site to be, to come into compliance with NR 151 or the performance standards. And of course, we rely heavily on UW Extension and those folks for, helping us with our outreach and communication, and really supporting us there, and making sure that we're getting the right messages out. So collectively we rely on each other for implementation, and it's critical that we maintain these relationships. So that's sort of the background of our ag performance standards and prohibitions in NR 151. And so that's part of what we wanted to communicate today. We also want to talk about the rulemaking, because ultimately I think a lot of people are interested in hearing what's the status of the nitrate targeted standard that's in the works. I wanted to share with you this timeline of the rulemaking process. There's a lot more to what this timeline is. There's about 37 to 40 steps that we go through for developing rules. And you can see on this timeline here, it starts with the scope statement of a rule, and then once that is approved by the Natural Resources Board, that starts the clock for us to have a rule developed and to the governor within 30 months. So we basically have 30 months at the start of the scope statement approval to create this. And so so far with the nitrate standard, we basically our clock started towards the end of 2019, and we started in early 2020 in February with our first meetings with a technical advisory committee. So we have a group of 20 plus people from all producers and nutrient management planners, agronomists, other agency officials, a whole group of scientists from our universities, people that are that could provide input onto what this rule would look like. And so we spent, and that's where this starts in this range through here. The rule development and preparation of the economic impact analysis is where a lot of this happens. So we went through, we have the scope statement approved, which describes what the rule would be, is intended to address, the issue that would tend to address. And then we get into actually starting the rule writing, the language that would be in the rule. And this is where we met monthly starting in February of 2020. And then with COVID getting in the way, it sort of shuffled our schedule around a little bit, but we got through with monthly virtual meetings with our technical advisory committee. And that's where the ink hits the paper with ideas and what would a rule look like. And so we're towards the end of this now that we've gone through our technical advisory committee meetings. We have a draft rule. We also have the draft economic impact analysis that was all through this process here. So with that, there's plenty of steps along the way. There's a public comment period that will go, that is actually now open today for the EIA. And so that's where we have the opportunities for the public to provide comments on the rule and other information related to this rule. And so that's, with that, it goes out for public comment. We receive those comments and we take time to respond to those comments. And so there's this, we receive information, we process it, and if there's reason to make changes to rules, that's where some of this changes. That's why it's critical to understand that the rule that we have right now is a draft rule. It's not a final rule. There may be changes to that rule based on that feedback that we get, but this is where it sort of starts. The rule, what's been created, goes out to the public, and it goes goes out to the public. We receive information back, and then eventually, after this EIA public comment period, then we'll have the draft rule go out for public comment. And that's where we'll get another opportunity for feedback on the actual draft rule. And that's, then that comes back and we go back and forth with, we receive that information, adjust the rule accordingly if necessary. And then we sort of end up at a final spot, and then it goes through other processes for approval and review. And so this is sort of the timeline we expect. I think on our schedule, is it summer of 2022, eventually that this process is, we hope that this rule would be to the governor and receive the governor's approval and meet our 30-month timeline there. So a lot goes on in this. We have a lot of steps that we track to stay on schedule. And this is just a snapshot of what the timeline for rule development looks like. So with that, Chris, that's all I have on the background, and send it over to you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Go ahead and switch screen sharing here. If you can stop yours, I'll.
Yep, let me just bring it up.
Here, I'll put in the request.
Yeah, my screen adjusted here and I can't find getting the buttons there. There they are.
There we go. Okay. Should be able to see my screen now. All right, thanks again, Mike. So I'll go ahead and pick it up where Mike left off. Like Mike mentioned, we are starting the 30-day public comment period today on the draft economic impact analysis. And what we're doing is soliciting information and data that the department can consider as we look to put together a final economic impact analysis of the draft rule. And what I'd like to do during this presentation is give a summary of the rule itself. So while the rule package on the economic analysis is available, also available with that package is the draft rule language and other plain language analysis and explanation of the rule itself. So let's go ahead and get started on this. Purpose of the targeted performance standard in this case is to reduce groundwater nitrate pollution in areas of the state that are deemed to be susceptible to groundwater contamination. The whole point eventually is to achieve compliance with the state's groundwater standard. The exceedance standard at the state level is 10 milligrams of nitrate per liter of water. All right, let me just give you a snapshot of the targeted area itself. So all of these areas in green here are defined in the draft rule as part of the targeted area, are also referred to as the sensitive area as well. Let me explain how we came to this conclusion on the targeted areas. So just to give context, the targeted area itself is defined in the rule, and it's defined in 3 different ways. First, it states that all cropland soils that meet the definition of a nitrogen restricted soil in the NRCS 590 nutrient management standard, that's the latest nutrient management standard in the state, that those soils are part of the targeted area. What these soils are, as is explained in that technical standard, is these are soils that are highest risk for nitrogen leaching to groundwater. Some examples would be soils that are very shallow to bedrock, soils that are in close proximity to community wells, soils that are typically wet, mapped as wet, so less than 1 foot to groundwater or to the water table, and also soils that are coarse textured, so soils that drain very easily. All right. Second, in the definition of identifying this targeted area, are fields that are in what we're referring to as nitrogen restricted areas, which are based on groundwater data. And they're listed in the draft rule by county, township, range, and section. So going back to that first bullet there, all of the nitrogen restricted soils, those high risk soils for nitrogen leaching, when you map those out, there are clearly pieces of the state or areas of the state that are contaminated, that have groundwater contamination of nitrogen, that are not part of that nitrogen restricted soil area. And so we worked with the technical advisory committee to take a look at groundwater data throughout the state, to find a process by which to take a look at that data and then determine whether or not areas were going to be included as part of the targeted area or not. So that's one definition in there. And then the very last one is fields that are in areas identified in a municipal wellhead protection plan when the municipal water system reaches a nitrate threshold of 5 milligrams per liter. Why 5 milligrams per liter? Why is that threshold in there? In areas that are already established as a municipal wellhead protection plan area, those municipalities are required by existing administrative rule to adopt more stringent monitoring of those wells once they start to go or exceed 5 milligrams per liter of nitrate in the wells. All right, so back to the map here. So you take those 3 definitions, map them out, and this is cropland that meets each of those definitions. You start to see where the targeted areas are throughout the state. There are greater concentrations in certain parts of the state, certainly the south central part of the state, central sands, as well as the Chippewa River Valley. And you can also see in some locations where there's sort of these squares. Those are areas there that were brought into the targeted area definition because of the groundwater data that exists in those areas. And so again, we started to look at those areas at the township scale. And then we went through a second process to winnow those down, and either where there was a township that had enough water quality data to show, yes, it needs to be part of this targeted area because generally water quality or groundwater is contaminated within that township. There we went through a process of removing areas from that township or adding adjacent areas to it, depending on the water quality data. I'll give you just a quick snapshot of different areas of the state. Okay. So that gives you a sense of where this standard actually applies, the targeted portion of this. Now I'll go through the actual performance standards and prohibitions. When we were meeting with our technical advisory committee, we wanted to establish a goal first in terms of developing the performance standard and prohibitions. Very practical goal here. Really what we're looking to do is establish standards that prevent excessive leaching of nitrogen from agricultural fields to groundwater that will cause or contribute to an exceedance of that groundwater quality standard that I mentioned before for nitrate, which is 10 milligrams per liter. So how does the draft actually do this? Sort of two things to think about. So we're developing a standard here, again, limits the amount of nitrogen that leaches. And we're really focused on finding a level, a standard, an amount that is just less than 10 milligrams per liter. And I'll get to that on the next slide. And then the second piece is that this all implementation wise happens through a producer's nutrient management plan. Okay, the actual numeric standard itself, the nitrogen leaching limit here in this case equals just less than 2.2 pounds of nitrate per acre per inch of groundwater recharge. So again, if our goal here is to meet that, let's not exceed 10 milligrams per liter through leaching of nitrogen from agricultural fields. We put it through a bit of an equation here to arrive at that 2.2 pounds of nitrate per acre per inch of groundwater recharge. That starts to bring that 10 milligrams per liter into a number that can be brought into nutrient management planning. A couple things to think about here too. That standard by alone, does it need to be met across all fields all the time? There's some flexibility built into this. So the standard of less than 2.2 pounds, that's set as an average annual limit across all acreage in a nutrient management plan. So a farmer has, let's say, 1,000 acres across their nutrient management plan. Each year, the average of all of that acreage needs to be less than 2.2 pounds of nitrate per acre per inch of groundwater recharge. Also, we want to think about setting this as a standard for each field so that there isn't a situation where you're creating hot spots by having a high nitrogen demanding crop in one field all the time. So the same standard is set as an average limit for each field within a nutrient management plan over a rotation. If a rotation is 5 years in length, then that field over those 5 years need to meet that standard. Some other things to think about as part of this design of the standard. I already referred to this in a sense. So what we're looking at is nitrogen losses for high nitrogen demanding crops. And those can be offset by other crops within a nutrient management plan. High demanding crops, low demanding crops, as long as they're balanced, again, where the average over the year across all acreage and the average for each field over the rotation meet that standard. And again, I already mentioned this. One thing that we're trying to assure is that no single field will have excess nitrogen loss over the rotation. A couple other things to think about as part of this performance standard. It applies to the entire targeted area. That might go without saying, but there's other portions of this where we're looking at subsets of the targeted area, and we'll get to that in a second. The performance standard applies to the entire targeted area. Again, it's implemented at the farm scale through nutrient management planning. And as Mike mentioned, this is something that he really talked about, that partnership that exists as part of this rule set, where DNR comes in with a performance standard and sets that performance goal. And then DATCAP picks it up with their rule set to define a technical standard. In other words, what is the practice that needs to be adopted by a producer? It could be adopted by a producer in order to meet that performance goal. That technical standard will need to be developed to establish nutrient application practices which limit the nitrate leaching from the soil and can be included as part of a nutrient management plan. All right, Let me jump to sort of a second piece of this rule, which has to do with irrigation water. There's a requirement in this rule also where a producer's nutrient management plan must account for all sources of nitrogen, including nitrogen that is applied to fields through irrigation water. As many of you are aware, certainly there are parts of the state where irrigation is dependent upon for agriculture, in which there can be elevated levels of nitrate in that irrigation water. And so this puts into place a requirement that needs to be accounted for as part of nutrient management planning. All right, two more parts to this rule. They're both prohibitions. Let's talk about what the goal is here of these prohibitions first. So really what we're looking to do here is to prevent significant leaching of nitrate from the soil in the spring during that high risk period in the spring before the crops are actually established, before crops are there to take that nutrient up and hold it in place, either use it or hold it in place. And so what we're proposing as part of the draft rule is a prohibition on applications of commercial fertilizer and liquid manure to fields in the fall and winter when there's no crop need for nitrogen. Some notes on this to think about. Again, this is implemented through nutrient management planning, just like before. In regards to the prohibition that's specific to commercial nitrogen fertilizer, this applies to the entire targeted area. For the prohibition that applies to liquid manure, it only applies to a subset of the targeted area. And where we're focused on for that particular prohibition on fall applications of liquid manure are areas that are highest risk when you're thinking about liquid manure to nitrogen leaching. And this is narrowed down to what's referred to as P soils, which is a grouping of soil types, basically coarse textured soils, so highly drained soils. And then you have R soils, which are soils that are mapped out less than 20 inches to bedrock, soils that are within 1,000 feet of a community well, and then fields that are within a wellhead protection area. Again, those areas that are meeting that threshold where nitrate is 5 milligrams per liter or greater. All right, let's start with the first prohibition. On applications of commercial nitrogen fertilizer, the prohibition starts after September 1 on an annual basis, and it provides exceptions for producers to continue to apply commercial nitrogen fertilizer in cases, really in a nutshell, to where it's being applied to a living crop. So fall seeded crops, there's exceptions for that. In cases where fall cover crops are used in potato rotations in order to reduce applications of soil fumigants to future potato crops, also there's an exception for that. There's also the third exception includes when applied to establish perennial crops. Okay, let's move to the prohibition on applications of liquid manure after September 1. And again, same concept here. This again only applies in that subset area of the entire targeted area and provides exceptions in cases when it's being applied to fall seeded crops, cover crops, for instance, established crops in that fall period after September 1. And it also includes an exception for a one-time fall application at a rate that's reduced to 25% or less of the typical rates that are allowed under nutrient management planning. All right, that's it on the rule. So as far as the process, what comes next? I mean, Mike certainly got into this from a larger picture. I'll just kind of throw some dates up here specifically where there's opportunity for the public to get involved and weigh in on the draft rule. One of which is now. Again, we just started today a 30-day comment period on the draft economic impact analysis, and that will run until April 10th. The public comment period on the draft rule itself will occur in early summer, And then of course, there's opportunity for the public to get involved and to weigh in and voice their opinions at the Natural Resources Board meeting, where we will be seeking adoption for this rule in either September or October later this year. I think Mike had this web link up on an earlier slide as well, but I'll go ahead and put it up on this one too. So if you were to go to this this website, if you type in, I guess, a Google search NR 151 nitrate targeted performance standard, you should arrive at this website, and it provides all the meeting materials for the Technical Advisory Committee meetings. It provides the draft rule materials, a nitrogen viewer so that you can take a look at the actual targeted area, zoom in, zoom out, and get a better look at that targeted area, and so on. A lot of different information. And with that, Kevin, I'll kick it over to questions if we have any.
Yeah, we do have a few questions coming in. For those of you that may have questions that haven't been entered yet, feel free to enter those in the chat feature, and we do have plenty of time for questions, so I'll try to cover as many as we can. If we start treading on the same ground, we might end the session a little bit early. I'll start off with, maybe just a question for you regarding that public comment period. You mentioned the public comment period starts today and runs sometime through April. If someone was looking to provide comment on that, what's the best way to do that, especially given, current restrictions maybe on in-person meetings that the DNR might be able to hold? How do you foresee kind of collecting those comments and implementing or integrating them into the discussion?
Yeah, good question. So if you go to the rule website, there is a solicitation notice which specifies exactly how we would like to receive comments. They can be sent by snail mail. We have an address where certainly comments can come in that way. And we also take comments. We've developed a special email address where people can send us directly comments on this rule.
So another question that a number of people have had, which is the kind of the following or the implementation. So getting farmers to develop a nutrient management plan is already a huge challenge. How do you expect implementation and enforcement of this new rule to kind of play out, or what's the process for implementation and enforcement related to this current proposed rule?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it, and then Mike, feel free to jump in at the end. So there's kind of two different ways that we initially look at implementation around a rule like this. NR 151 and any changes that are adopted like this targeted standard also get rolled into NR 243, which is the administrative rules for concentrated animal feeding operations, which means it applies to those operations also through permitting. And so the requirements through a permit process would happen, and the way we've dealt with that, the implementation with the Silurian bedrock rule, is to look at the 5-year CAFO permitting process. Every CAFO gets a revised permit over a 5-year period every 5 years, and so after 5 full years, all permitted CAFOs then would have this brought into their nutrient management plan as new requirements. Then for those farms that obviously are not permitted CAFOs, then you're starting to talk about cost share. How much cost share do we have to provide to producers to allow them to comply with the rule? And obviously one thing that you mentioned, Kevin, as part of that question was overall adoption of nutrient management plans in different parts of the state. Some parts of the state are certainly ahead or further ahead than others in terms of adoption of nutrient management plans. And so those are all things that we'll be taking into consideration as we look forward to thinking about a strategy around implementation of this rule in particular, on top of implementation of our existing performance standards and the recently adopted Silurian bedrock standard as well. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that or not.
No, I mean, you know, the implementation process is no different just because it's a new rule. That's all defined in 151, the steps there. But I think no doubt we'll have a lot of you know, there's education and outreach and continue you know, getting the message out there through any opportunity with outreach, and of course our producer led groups that are, you know, a lot of what some of the groups are doing already to manage their nitrogen are, you know, there's outreach there. So there's looking for those opportunities as well, that outreach, the message and sharing of information, and through those kind of groups, through those farmer-led groups, I think is an important important tool or important mechanism for that outreach as well, and working with those producers that are already leading this change and being you know, how they're managing that nitrogen and the messaging from that. So I think that's an important group that will help with that implementation through outreach and education.
You mentioned there's a couple of questions that came in about kind of Kewaunee County and some of the challenges that they've had. And you mentioned the Silurian bedrock targeted performance standard. And I think there might be a little confusion because there's multiple targeted performance standards. Could you just provide a little bit of clarification on maybe the timeline, you know, for that process for the Silurian performance standard, where that's at?
Yep.
And whether or not you've, you know, had any challenges in terms of implementation on that, or lessons that you may have learned on implementation from that particular targeted performance.
Yeah, so to clarify that, my apologies if that didn't come out as clear, that the Silurian bedrock performance standard was our first targeted standard that we created. So that's already been created. It's already in NR 151. It's a existing targeted standard in our rule. So we started that process back in 2016, and it's following a similar process that we're doing here for the nitrate standard. So that started in 2016, and it was finalized in 2018. It was promulgated in 151 and became law in July of 2018. So that's already done. It's already been created. You know, the challenges there, things though. I think one thing that we've learned, you know, especially with that performance standard, was again, that education and outreach component. You know, working closely with producers in those counties and meeting with them frequently to help them understand what this rule actually means. You know, and working closely with counties to assess, you know, how much of this actually applies in our counties, and no doubt certain counties have more of the Silurian bedrock than others. So, you know, recognizing that some counties have more of the shallow bedrock and were impacted more by that rule. You know, then obviously with that, then there's other producers then that are more impacted than others. So, you know, it's understanding where a lot of the who you should be meeting with and how frequently, and it's that communication outreach, having that a realistic expectation that this stuff isn't going to occur overnight. You know, it's going to take time for people to understand the requirement and to make adjustments to their you know, to their operations to you know, to comply with those rules. So you know, they're different rules. I think it's you know, so yes, we've definitely learned with the education outreach. It's important to meet with counties so that they have a similar message when their boots are on the ground and meeting with farms to you know, for the education component and outreach.
It's another question, and it's a question that came in kind of early, and I know that you kind of touched on it a little bit, but regarding the maps and what constitutes targeted performance, some questions about specific formations or specific types of aquifers. Can you maybe just again reiterate, when it comes to kind of soils and geology, what the criteria were for you know, for determining sensitive areas that deserve targeted performance?
Yeah, so the scope statement, I wish I had read it right before the presentation here to refresh my mind exactly. But the scope statement was fairly broad in a sense, and allowed us the opportunity to really work with the technical advisory committee to identify those areas of the state based on factors such as soil type, um, permeability, soil permeability, geology, and different geological features that are higher risk for nitrogen leaching and contamination to aquifers of the state. So it provided that framework for us to work with the technical advisory committee to arrive at ultimately answering the question, which we're attempting to do as part of this draft rule of what are the most sensitive areas in the state here? What are the areas we're looking to protect? What are the areas that are most susceptible to nitrate contamination and groundwater?
And just, the question was specific to kind of Crawford and Vernon County, and, they mentioned Roundtree Formation, sandstone aquifers. The soils designation, the depth to bedrock designations are probably not would you say they're not that specific in terms of identifying, specific formations, let's say?
Yeah, that's correct, Kevin. Yeah, so again, kind of going back and to the first part that I was talking about, what went into that ultimate definition of targeted area. So we were focusing mostly at the soil layer first, and thinking about different types of soils that are most susceptible to nitrogen leaching to groundwater. And so depth to bedrock is a big one, and essentially what we're looking at is bringing out soils where you have less than 5 feet depth to bedrock of soils, those highly porous, coarse textured soils again, as well as wet soils where the water table is within a foot of the soil surface. So that was sort of the first cut. Where I think we started to get into not directly, but indirectly into maybe addressing some of those areas that you just mentioned, Kevin, some of those those geological areas that you mentioned in those couple of counties is when we looked at the water quality data itself. When we started to get a feel for, based on certain criteria, where do we know based on the data are areas of the state that are contaminated and therefore should be brought into the targeted area. So indirectly, we I believe got at that.
Thanks. That's an important point that I've heard you all talk a number of times, but it's worth mentioning that there's both the sensitive area designation based on maybe more physical geology or properties, and then there's the data generated sensitive areas that kind of uses some of that well water data to identify those areas that may fall outside the boundaries of those geologic concerns, but have been impacted. So thanks for kind of addressing that in a little bit more detail. Another question here when it comes to you mentioned the economic analysis that's going to be performed. And obviously there's cost to kind of the growers or the farmers. A question about, what else the other externalities maybe to municipalities or well owners, what's included in that economic analysis for purposes of this targeted performance?
Yeah, good question. So the economic analysis that we're required to perform as part of a draft rule. First of all, the first thing we need to address is what are the costs to small businesses due to implementation of these requirements, this new regulation, right? So that points directly at what is the impact to farms in this case, and the economic analysis. When someone takes a look at it, we'll see that we get into detail on answering that question and then arriving at a cost estimate at the end of the day. But it also gets into and allows us the opportunity to talk about other costs related to the rule. So costs to municipalities, health costs also. So in a sense, what we're looking at is, because of the requirements, because of the benefits of this rule, We're looking to avoid certain costs related to, for instance, well replacement, treatment due to high nitrate levels. And we put numbers to those estimates as well. So they're all in the mix there. And certainly if anybody has comments, again, data and information that we could consider to make changes to this draft EIA based on those estimates, then certainly be happy to take a look at that.
Another question here, when it comes to targeted performance, we talked a little bit about the physical geology, the data-driven component, but there's also that municipal wellhead protection component that you brought up. And the question is, is that wellhead protection area based on a specific time of travel for the well or to the well, or the entire recharge area? How did you determine that area that should be included for the purposes of this rule?
Yeah, so we didn't tinker with the definition of wellhead protection areas as they currently exist, or that program. So essentially, we're borrowing that definition. So in places, again, there's a certain definition for what is a wellhead protection area, and we're borrowing that and using that definition as part of this rule, and not trying to recreate here. Now, in terms of wellhead protection, I would have to look back and double check that, Kevin, exactly. But I believe that there's a methodology that's defined as when a municipality is taking on the task of developing a wellhead protection program. There's a methodology that's defined around that as to how they go about creating that defining that area exactly. I don't recall offhand exactly. I want to say it's close to a 5-year time of travel, perhaps. But yeah, don't quote me on that one.
Another question about the one-time exception for manure applications, and maybe asking if one of you would be able to expand a little bit on that one-time exception, and what the criteria would be, or the process for approving that one-time exception.
Yeah, so that exception is based on a conversation that we had, several conversations that we had with our technical advisory committee. And we presented the prohibition, first of all, on let's have a prohibition on fall applications of liquid manure within this area. One of the thoughts immediately was that's going to be difficult for certain producers, particularly dairy producers, of course, that are used to having storage. A lot of farms that use liquid manure have storage, and so it's a certain size. They empty their storage tanks generally in the spring and in the fall. And by limiting that fall application period, then it puts some pressure on producers. And so we went back and forth on the pros and cons of that a little bit. A lot of the technical advisory committee admitted, look, the long-term goal certainly would be to have a prohibition and not need to have a one-time exception at a reduced rate. But eventually we ended up including that as part of the draft rule, a one-time exception, because there's no rules around how many times a farm applies in the fall currently on a field, as long as they're meeting their nutrient management plan. But this is a one-time, again, exception on a field at that reduced rate, 25% of the typical of what's allowed under nutrient management planning. So that's the thought behind that particular exception.
And thanks for that. I think they were looking for you to elaborate a little bit on that, and I think you did. So appreciate that. Another question about kind of, is there going to be a process for regular review or updates of the standard, or maybe the maps that you displayed. And I kind of know the answer to that because I've heard you talk a number of times, but I think it'd be beneficial for people on the call maybe to get some information on what the plan is, you know, for that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a question that we've gotten a lot, and for a couple of different reasons. Certainly, some people have wondered whether or not there's an opportunity to go out and collect new data and information from areas that might be short on water quality data, to present and be considered for addition to the rule. And then there's other cases sort of from the farming community where, okay, perhaps I'm in the targeted area today, and have new requirements, but what happens if we're able to actually bring nitrogen levels or nitrate levels below the exceedance standard, so below 10 milligrams per liter? Is there a way to then remove that targeted area and those requirements from those areas that are successful? The way the rule is designed and built right now is that those areas, and you'll see if you go to the draft rule language, it's a table, it's laid out as a table. These are the areas geographically that are included as part of the targeted area. So it's static based on data that the department acquired back, I think it was August of 2020 or July of 2020. At that time, we analyzed the data and went through that process. And these are the areas that are being proposed based on groundwater data. And then what it would take in order to change either addition or subtraction of that area over time is a new rule process into the future. And yeah. I guess that's the best way to describe it, really.
And I just, you know, having participated in some of those conversations, I just add that, you know, because groundwater quality doesn't change dramatically overnight, you know, the ability of the process to adapt, you know, is definitely something that I think people have questions about. But knowing how slowly groundwater quality changes, maybe, you know, provide some peace of mind, you know, regarding the speed at which these updates occur. You know, I think the maps by and large have done a pretty good job of identifying those areas that we would suspect to be most susceptible. Thanks for addressing that particular question. Another question that came in, you know, a lot of the people joining us today are interested in lakes, and, you know, realize that fertilizers on residential areas, you know, septic system effluents could also be a source of nitrate. Are those addressed in this standard or this process, this rulemaking process? If you could comment a little bit about those other sources and whether or not this particular rulemaking process has any implications for those potential sources.
For non-agricultural sources.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, so this goes back to the piece that I was just discussing a second ago that you had asked me about, which was the process that we went through in order to use the groundwater data to define targeted areas. Part of that process and the methodology that we went through, certainly there was an interest by the Technical Advisory Committee to consider non-agricultural sources of nitrogen. And where there might be areas through the state where maybe you have exceedances of the groundwater standard in wells, but maybe there's influence there from non-agricultural sources. So we did take into account other sources of nitrogen apart from agriculture as part of that methodology, and it worked its way into that. And just to add another point to that, so this methodology that we used, again, to identify those static areas defined as part of the targeted area specific to the ones that were supported by groundwater data, you know, that methodology itself is not in the rule, but will be included as part of the rule package when we go out for public comments later. Sort of the second public comment stage on the rule itself. There will be supporting documentation that will be included, the methodology that was used to take that to analyze the groundwater data and make determinations on what is in or what's not in the targeted area.
A number of people listening might also work for various counties. So there's a question about the role of, land and water conservation departments as it relates to kind of the implementation of this standard, and what kind of funding or resources might be available to support those efforts.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this bridges the gap between some comments that we went through before on implementation. So, I mean, the counties a lot of times are the ones out in front working with producers on adoption of nutrient management plans. So that's one piece of successful implementation here, certainly. As far as additional funding for that, I mean, there's no additional funding that comes with specifically with this rule. It's a requirement. So we're looking right now at existing funding sources, and I think, one thing that we would want to take a look at, certainly, because we're starting, it's a targeted standard. So we're talking about targeted implementation in a sense here too, is some of our grant programs like the TRIM, the Targeted Runoff Management grant program, and how a grant program like that could be used if and when this rule goes into place. And we're considering how we would want to implement that, or help counties implement that rule in specific locations around the state to try to deal with this issue.
The questions are we're getting through most of them, and a lot of them have similar themes, but I just want to circle back. Someone was asking for a little bit more clarity on the manure exception, and whether it was a one-time exception forever, or does the one-time exception renew annually?
Yeah, the way it's written, it's a one per fall, per fall season, one application of liquid manure on a field. Again, at that reduced rate, 1/4 of the typical rate that would be applied on that field per the nutrient management standard currently as it exists right now.
So again, the questions are starting to repeat themselves. Maybe wait another minute or so if any last minute questions trickle in. There's one that came in about some of the data used when it comes to that data-driven component of the targeted performance, and just the the most recent data. So how recently did you make that cutoff when it comes to data for inclusion in that targeted performance?
Yeah, again, I mean, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was July or August of this last year when we grabbed the data. And so we did not accept or look for additional data past that point, when we then set forth with our methodology and analyzing that data for the purposes of defining some of these areas based on the groundwater data.
Thanks for that clarification. And again, I think we've covered the majority of questions that have come through. In the interest of kind of our speakers' time and everybody else's time on the line, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this particular session. Offer up any last minute opportunities for Chris or Mike, anything that you didn't have a chance to cover or say during your time that you might want to mention. And if don't feel like you need to here, just offering you closing thoughts.
I mean, I think just one little clarification there, Chris, is just to recognize the differences between the two public comment periods. Again, clarifying that this first public comment period that we have now is specific to comments related to the economic impact analysis. So again, the rule is out there with it to understand what the rule is about and how the analysis was developed. So those comments for this first comment period should be related to that EIA. And then as you can see here, it'll be in early summer, that another public comment period will be open for specific to the draft rule then. So just understand that the two differences there. That you may not get a response to a comment about the rule with this first public comment period, because we're going to be focusing on comments regarding the economic impact analysis.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add too, in terms of, you know, information, more to expect as we go on, Kevin, is so we put out an invitation today also for our technical advisory committee to meet with them on March 25th, and go through and give an overview of the draft rule, and give an overview of the draft economic impact analysis also. And as part of that, certainly, I mean, that is a meeting for the technical advisory committee, but it is open to the public if anyone wishes to look in on that meeting. And there's an agenda as well as a registration link for Zoom for that meeting on the same website, the same web link that's up here on the screen currently. It's under the TAC meeting March 25th, near the bottom of the page, included in that agenda.
Thank you both for taking the time to join today. I think we're going to wrap up this session and conclude the 1:30 to 3 o'clock time slot. I just want to, again, thank you both for presenting. Let people know that there's a number of exhibits that are available for people to stop in virtually at to solicit or kind of interact with some of our sponsors. There are a number of additional days, Tuesday, Wednesday, as well as Thursday, where there's ongoing sessions and activities that people might be interested in. So please keep your eyes open and attuned to any additional sessions that you might want to attend in the coming days. And with that, I think we'll conclude the session. Thank you, everybody.